And you basically go on to say, don't you, that at that point, when they're out at the ambulance, that you have a conversation with her when she describes the knife for the first time.
Again, it's when the paramedics came back.
So it says here, doesn't it, that after you sat her down while the paramedics are gone, what happened at that point? And that's you talking about the question that you asked. And you said at that point, she stated that he started having a manic episode. She had grabbed a knife in an attempt to scare him, and then he suddenly lunged. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Yes. And again, a few pages later, on pages 14 over to 15, you were asked the question.
Yes.
You said, the question was, okay, and at what point after you arrived was there a discussion about bringing her to the hospital? And you said, after paramedics came in, and when they hooked up Mr. Ricci to the machine, they discovered a puncture wound in his chest. You see that?
Yes.
And then the question is, once the puncture wound was discovered, did you or other officers ask any follow-up questions to the defendant? And you said no.
Correct.
Now, you don't tell Ms. Ricci, correct, that she's going to the police station?
I did not know.
And none of the officers did, right?
I can't speak. I'm not sure.
Wasn't there an attempt to sort of make her believe that she was going to the hospital?
Objection.
If you know.
Hold on. If you know.
Yes. We're making arrangements to take her to the hospital prior to, obviously later discovering stab wounds.
Right. So when you changed your mind, you didn't let her know you changed your mind.
I did not know.
And nobody in your department did, right?
Can't speak for them. I'm not sure.
Okay. But you know that at some point a decision was made to bring her to the police station?
Correct.
And you're not aware as to whether or not she was ever told about that. Do I have that right?
Correct.
Right. When you first arrive and see the collapsed man on the ground that you realize your fellow officers have to attend to, his body is about, you said, 2 feet away from approximately the knife that was dropped?
Yes.
Okay. And that is essentially less than a foot away from a set of stairs, right, that go from the kitchen into the dining room. Do you remember that?
I don't remember the stairs, no.
Okay. Do you remember that it was right next to the entry between the kitchen and that living room, dining room area?
I do remember that, yes.
Okay. You don't remember that that living room, dining area was sunken?
I don't recall, no.
Okay. One moment. I have nothing else.
Redirect. Thank you. Sir, defense counsel asked you about a further conversation you had with the defendant in the kitchen, correct?
Yes.
Just so we're abundantly clear, do you know what, let me ask you this, did you write a report right after this happened?
Yes, that night.
And so you wrote a report that night, correct?
Correct.
The transcript defense counsel was showing you that was actually testified to approximately 6 months later, correct, in January?
Yes.
So with regard to your police report, do you remember when it was fresh in your head that particular day, the order things happened, sir?
Yes.
Please tell us what that order was.
I arrived on scene, again, thinking it's a medical. 2 other officers arrived simultaneously with me. They start rendering aid to the victim. I went in. The defendant was frantic. I tried to calm her down. At some point, I asked what had happened. She said he was having an episode and he collapsed. At that time, I turned towards the victim to maybe help if, render aid as well. Again, the defendant is still frantic. The fire department arrives on scene. They place him on a backboard, take over care. They put him in the ambulance. A few minutes later, seconds maybe, they come back in and speak with either Officer Kelly or Officer Hunt, who then, relays what they had said to me.
Which was what?
That they found a stab wound on his chest. And that's when I further discussed what had happened with the defendant.
And it was then and only then she told you something different than she had previously stated regarding him collapsing.
Correct.
And defense counsel asked you about the timing in which you saw the knife on the ground near where Michael Ricci had been on his back, correct?
Yes.
And then he asked you, then you learned about the stab wound, and you, and correct me if I'm wrong, said that's when I put it all together.
Correct.
Remember saying that?
Yes, I had noticed the knife when I walked in.
So what did you mean? Because there wasn't a follow-up question about that. What did you mean when you said you put it all together?
Well, I would object to his conclusions, his investigatory conclusions, as being the problems of the jury.
He can explain what he meant by the comment only. You put it all together. You may explain what you meant by that, sir.
I realized it was more than a medical.
At what point? When you saw the knife or something different?
When the statements were made to me, and by the fire department, and then as well as what the defendant said happened.
And in terms of the change in where the defendant, Christine Ricci, was to be taken from the scene, can you explain originally where was she going to be transported to?
To the hospital.
And why was that?
We believed her husband was having a medical issue, and she was obviously pretty frantic. So as well as get her aid at the hospital, but be with her loved one.
And at some point that changed. At what juncture did that change, that she was no longer going to be taken to the hospital for what you believe to be her husband's medical and instead taken to the police station?
Again, after the fire department informed us of their findings in the ambulance, as well as what the defendant said immediately after.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Recross.
Nothing further.
The witness may step down.
Thank you.
Commonwealth may call its next witness.
Commonwealth will call Christopher Bradley to the stand.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please tell the jury your first and last name?
Sure. Christopher Bradley.
And how do you spell your last name for the record?
Last name spelled Bradley.
And where do you work, sir?
I work for the Marshfield Fire Department.
How long have you worked for the Marshfield Fire Department?
In total, a little over 4 years now.
And what is your role with the fire department?
I work as a firefighter paramedic.
Can you explain to us what your duties and responsibilities are as a firefighter paramedic in the...
Sure. In the town of Marshfield, our primary duties are advanced life support, emergency medical services.
Just slow down a little bit.
Oh, I'm
Thank
sorry.
you.
Okay. Emergency medical services at the advanced life support level, fire suppression, life safety, and property conservation.
And currently, most of the members of the department are cross-trained in both of those areas of being a paramedic and also a firefighter, correct?
Correct.
And so can you explain to us how shifts work with the fire department?
Sure. So we all work twice a week, 24-hour shifts, beginning at 8 a.m. and ending at 8 a.m. the following day. The schedule goes as 24 hours on, followed by 48 hours off, another 24-hour shift, followed by 96 hours off.
Okay. And how are assignments given out when you are working one of those 24-hour shifts?
Typically, we have a rotating schedule, and that'll be deemed by the shift commander, who's a captain or an officer on duty. He will assign us the different roles as far as apparatus positions and where we're riding that day.
And how often in a 24-hour shift do those roles rotate?
It depends. Lately, our current shift manning is at 11, and at night we'll drop down to 10. So we'll run one primary ambulance, and the secondary ambulance will have to be cross-staffed with an engine driver and also the ladder driver.
And are there more than one fire stations in the town of Marshfield?
Yes.
How many are there?
3 total.
And does each station have their own series of apparatus, meaning the paramedic bus and the fire engines?
Yes.
And back in January of 2021, were you assigned to a particular station in the town of Marshfield?
Yes, I was assigned to Station 3.
And were you still working that same 24-hour shifts?
Yes.
And again, back in January of 2021, those assignments that you were given on any given shift, were they similar as you just described or different in some way?
Similar.
And at Station 3 in Marshfield, what are the different apparatus that are at that location?
The apparatus that we have at Station 3 are the frontline ladder truck, Engine 3, and we hold paramedics 1, 2, and 3, which is the town's ambulances.
I'm going to draw your attention specifically to January 28th of 2021. Do you recall working a 24-hour shift that day?
Yes.
And do you recall being dispatched out to a particular residence on Moraine Street in Marshfield at approximately 4:45 p.m.?
Yes.
What was your understanding of the nature of the call you were responding to?
To the best of my recollection, the call came in for a gentleman who was shoveling snow in his driveway and had slipped on the ice.
Objection. Move to strike.
I'll see you at the side of the bench.
I'm sorry, sir, had you finished your answer about what your recollection of the nature of the call was?
I was just in the middle of it. So to the best of my knowledge, the call came in for a gentleman who had slipped in his driveway while shoveling snow and had struck his head in the pavement.
And as a firefighter and also as a paramedic in the town of Marshfield, that type of information, is it useful to you responding to a scene so that you have an idea on what you're walking into?
Yes.
And on this particular day, January 28th, on this particular call, what was your assignment that day?
I was the driver of Marshfield Engine 3.
And when a medical call comes out by 911, is there always a fire truck dispatched with an ambulance and the police?
Yes.
Now, when you arrived at 679 Marine Street, where did you go and what did you do?
So we arrived on Marine Street and we parked. The residence is kind of on an upslope. We parked on Marine Street as well as the ambulance did, I believe, and we walked up the driveway. Didn't observe anyone to be in the driveway, and we entered the home.
And did the engine arrive around the same time as the ambulance?
Yes.
Were there any other emergency vehicles on scene prior to your arrival?
Yes.
And what emergency vehicles?
Marshfield Police Department.
When you entered the house, where did you and the other firefighters go?
Initially, where we entered on a side entrance, it led into what I believe was the dining room area.
And what did you see when you entered into the dining room area?
When we entered, I witnessed 2 to 3 Marshfield police officers performing life-saving measures on a gentleman who was laying on his back on the dining room area.
At life-saving measures, what did you observe them doing?
They were performing CPR on the patient, and they were preparing to apply the AED and ventilate him.
Did you notice whether the man lying on his back was at all responsive?
He was unresponsive at the time.
And were there any other individuals present in the home at the time when you arrived into that dining room area?
Yes.
Who else was present?
From what I gathered, it was the patient's spouse and one of the children, female daughter.
Did you have the opportunity to make observations of their demeanor when you arrived in the home?
Yes.
And what was their demeanor?
They were very emotionally upset, given everything that was transpiring.
And once you arrived in the home, what was your primary focus?
Our primary focus was to figure out what had happened and then to assume patient care of the patient.
And being that you were on the engine that day, were there other firefighters that were assigned to the ambulance?
Yes.
And who was assigned to the ambulance that responded with you?
The ambulance that night had firefighter James Majensky and firefighter Matthew Cohen.
And are you aware of what their roles were on the ambulance that night?
Yes.
And what were their roles particularly?
So their roles were just to treat and transport as far as any medical call would go. And typically on the ambulance, after one call was completed, roles switch, meaning that whoever drove to the call, the secondary person would be in the back of the ambulance teching and doing the documentation. When the call is complete, roles switch. The other person who had just teched the call with the patient will now drive. The person who drove will now take over patient care for the next medical call.
Okay, so there are very clearly defined roles on the 2-man ambulance on who is to do what. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And so one person is primarily for patient care on each call, and one person is tasked with driving the ambulance.
Correct.
And in this particular instance, do you know of firefighter Cohen and Majensky who was doing what on this particular call?
I believe firefighter Cohen, it was his turn to tech the call, and firefighter Majensky, I believe, was the driver.
So when you say tech the call, do you mean attending to the patient?
Correct, assuming patient care.
Okay. And in certain circumstances, because you are all cross-trained as Marshfield firefighters, are you able to assist on a call, even if you drove an engine there?
Yes.
And in this circumstance, did you assist?
Yes.
What were your observations of the man that was lying on the floor?
As I stated before, the gentleman presented as unresponsive. Initially, and I can speak for myself, my primary survey, I didn't see any outward signs of trauma, any gross injury or anything like that, which is usually what we look for as regards to an unresponsive patient.
By outward signs of trauma, what would you look for that circumstance?
Any blunt force trauma, any massive bleeding, anything.
And so on this particular patient, you didn't observe either of those things?
No, I did not.
And how about the patient's clothing? At the time that you and the other firefighters arrived, was his clothing intact?
Yes, it was.
Did you make note of anything around the patient that would have informed how you would administer care to the patient?
No, I did not. As I said, he was just laying on his back, kind of in the corner of the dining room up against a wall.
And what did firefighter Cohen and Majensky do to administer patient care?
As soon as, well, myself included, once we entered the room, we had taken over CPR. We also brought in our equipment from the ambulance, as well as our mechanical CPR device and a longboard. We began chest compressions and then applied our, what we call a Lucas device, which is the mechanical CPR device that I had mentioned.
Now, if you had observed some evidence of obvious trauma, would that have altered your care of the patient?
No.
And why is that in this circumstance? The primary goal.
The primary goal is to treat all life-threatening injuries or illnesses. And in this case, where the patient was unresponsive, he was not breathing on his own and had no palpable pulses, we then began CPR.
And you indicated that you and the other firefighters applied the mechanical device called a Lucas device, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have the occasion to speak with any of the family members that you described observing in the home prior to the patient care?
Not that I recall.
At any point in your recollection of being in the house that particular night, did you speak with either the daughter or the wife?
No.
And how about police? Did you have any particular conversations with the police officer when you arrived to try to assess how to properly care for the patient?
I don't believe so.
After you and the other firefighters applied the device, what was the next step that you took with the patient?
The next step was to load him onto one of our backboards and secure him with straps so that we could then extricate him from the home outside to the stretcher.
And is that normal protocol?
Yes.
What occurred when you got into the ambulance?
When we got into the ambulance, I can remember turning on our cardiac monitor I believe the CPR device was still going. Firefighter Cohen was going to expose the patient, meaning cut off his clothing. And I believe Firefighter Majensky was still ventilating him with a bag valve mask.
And is that also normal protocol to cut off the patient's clothing when you're in that kind of environment to further assess or do a secondary assessment of the patient when you're in that environment of the ambulance?
Correct.
And so what happened when Firefighter Cohen cut off the patient's clothes?
As Firefighter Cohen exposed the patient and cutting off his shirt, we discovered a penetrating wound to the patient's chest.
And can you tell us a little bit about what that means when you describe it as a penetrating wound?
So it was a wound that it was on the front side of the chest, more towards, I believe, the left chest wall, to the best of my knowledge. And it was just indicative of an object that had penetrated through the patient's chest.
Was that wound bleeding at that point?
Not at that point, no.
Okay. Did you yourself observe any kind of amounts of blood on the clothing or in and around the patient once his chest was exposed?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Did you yourself observe any sort of blood on the patient's clothing or in and around his body once his shirt was cut off?
I only observed the wound to start bleeding. It took a few minutes, but with the device that was performing chest compressions, then the wound did begin bleeding.
And so what happened in the ambulance to try to address that particular wound?
So with that particular wound, with any type of a penetrating trauma to the chest wall, we will cover that with what we call occlusive dressing to keep any outside atmospheric air from entering into the chest cavity.
And as the patient's clothing was removed and this wound was discovered, were any other wounds noted on the patient that were significant to you and the other?
I believe, to the best of my knowledge, there was also another laceration, I believe, to the backside of his left shoulder.
Is it fair to say that deep penetrating wound was the primary focus once it was discovered?
Yes.
Did you at all leave the ambulance after that wound was discovered?
Once all interventions at that time were completed, yes, I did.
And at the time that you were in the back of the ambulance with Firefighter Cohen and Majensky, were there any other Marshfield fire officers present?
Yes.
And who was that other person?
That was Captain Patrick Smith.
And what was his role on scene that day?
He was the captain of Engine 3, with whom I was riding with, and ultimately he was the shift commander that day for our group for the town marshal.
And was he present when that wound was discovered by Firefighter Cohen?
Yes.
And what did you see Captain Smith do after the wound was discovered?
We informed him of our discovery, and then I believe he exited the ambulance and then told the police what we had found.
At any point when the patient was in the back of the ambulance, did you ever get a pulse?
No.
Did he ever start breathing?
No.
Did you ever notice him to be alert or oriented or open his eyes at any point?
No.
And once he was stable enough, was he transported to the hospital?
Yes.
And how was he transported? Who drove the ambulance at that point?
I did.
And so what did Firefighter Cohen and Majensky do at that point?
They stayed in the back of the ambulance to continue life-saving measures.
And at that point, was it necessary that both of them tend to the patient in the back, and that's why you drove the ambulance?
Yes.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Thank you.
Cross-exam.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
You mentioned a little bit on direct examination about the division of labor within the fire department, particularly when you're responding to a scene as a ambulance first responder. Remember that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is it normal for one of the officers to write a report, one of the firefighters to write a report?
As far as a medical report goes, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, the reporting person, is that decided before the call comes in, or is that also rotated the way you described it?
It's rotated, sir.
Okay. And so is it typical for the person who writes the report to note in the report the reason for the call initially?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so they would get that from dispatch and they would make note of it as soon as they got it so that they could put it in the report?
Typically, it would be either before or after at the hospital when we document, sir.
Okay. And you were not the officer that wrote the report in this case, correct?
Correct.
When you remove Mr. Ricci's clothes in the back of the ambulance, all three of you were in the back, or just Cohen and Majensky?
All three of us, sir.
All three of us. Is it your position that you noticed at that point the cut on the back of the shoulder, or do you think you've discovered that later?
I would say we discovered that after.
Okay. And obviously the person who wrote the report would have been writing a report about that in the hours immediately after the shift, or even sooner, right?
Yes, sir.
When the facts are still fresh, before they know anything about the case or anything like that could
Yes.
affect their memory.
Yes.
And that's important, right? As a police officer, or as anybody who writes a report. I know you're not a police officer.
Correct.
But as a firefighter, a first responder, getting those memories when they're fresh, right?
Yes.
Before they've had an opportunity to hear things and have it affect you.
Yes.
When you discover the penetrating wounds and you tell Chief Smith, you say Chief Smith goes and tells the police. Does that happen in the driveway?
This was so when Captain Smith was in the ambulance, we alluded to him what we had found.
Uh-huh.
He then exited the side door of the ambulance. I don't know if the police were still inside the residence or if they were immediately outside the ambulance.
Okay. But you know he talked to police, so you must have seen him talking to police personnel?
I didn't observe that myself, sir.
Oh,
But I know that he did exit the ambulance, and I'm assuming that he went and talked to them.
And so when Detective Smith learns about the puncture wound and goes and talks to the police, are there police officers, in fact, out in that driveway at that point?
I'm not sure because I was still in the back of the ambulance.
Okay. So you don't know where the officers were at the moment that Smith learns about the puncture wound?
No.
And as far as you know, they could have been in the driveway or they could have been in the house, either one of those things?
Correct.
Okay. What is clear, however, is that inside the house, when you first arrive, the police officers, the Marshfield police officers, are doing CPR.
Yes.
And there's no bleeding that's occurring.
Yes.
There's no blood around the body, correct?
Correct.
And you guys are all trained first responders, right?
Correct.
And looking at that body in that position, you weren't able to tell that there had been a penetrative wound.
Correct.
And you also weren't, and in fact, the only time the wound on his chest bled was when you started to do artificial electrical currents into his heart to make it beat, correct?
I would say it began bleeding significantly when we applied the Lucas device for chest compressions.
Right. Because that can start the heart pumping artificially, right?
It can produce artificial compressions at the adequate rate and depth, sir.
So it would. So in other words, because now the heart is pumping, it's bleeding.
Correct, because it's trying to perfuse the rest of the body and the brain.
Mm-hmm. So there was no blood at the scene. Is it your understanding that that is an indication that his heart had stopped pumping inside the house?
I'm not sure, sir.
Did you take any vitals inside the house?
We initially, I believe, I don't remember if it was myself or one of my other coworkers, checked. I myself did not,
okay,
but someone had checked a pulse, and we also assessed breathing rapidly. We did not see any chest rise or fall, and I believe he was pulseless at that time.
Okay, so there were no vital signs as far as you remember inside the house?
Correct.
All right, nothing further.
Nothing further. Thank you.
May I step down, sir? Commonwealth may call its next witness.
Commonwealth would call Matthew Cohen.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir. Basically, raise my hand.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony and the evidence that you give to the court and the jury are not true to the Commonwealth, independent of the bar, from the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth of God?
You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please tell the jury your first and last name and spell your last name for the record?
Matthew Cohen, C-O-H-E-N.
And how are you employed?
Marshfield firefighter paramedic.
How long have you been with the Marshfield Fire Department?
17 years.
And are you primarily a paramedic, or do you have another role with the Marshfield Fire?
We're dual certified, so paramedic and firefighter, we do both.
And so as at being dual certified, what are your trainings as a paramedic? What type of care are you trained in?
As a paramedic, we have full paramedic ACLS accreditation, so we're trained as a paramedic, which is about a 2. I'm sorry?
You have to slow down a little bit. Sorry.
It's about a 2-year program. To be trained as a paramedic, we're also trained in CPR, ACLS, PALS.
And so are you certified to give the highest level of paramedic care to patients as opposed to basic life services?
Correct. Paramedic is the highest in the state.
And working for the Marshfield Fire Department, do you work a particular type of shift, or what's the...
We work 24-hour shifts. The rotation is 1 shift on, 2 shifts on, and then another shift on, and then 4 shifts off.
And that 24-hour shift, what are the hours?
8 a.m. to 8 a.m. the following day.
And are assignments handed out on the basis of whatever shift you work, or do you have a set assignment?
The captain of the shift creates a rotation. So that rotation, we're on different pieces each day.
I'm going to draw your attention back to January of 2021. Were you assigned to a particular station in the town of Marshfield during that time period?
Station 3.
And Station 3, is that a manned station that has people there for the entire 24-hour shift?
Yep, that's the central station, which is our headquarters, so that has the most personnel.
On January 28th of 2021, were you working one of those 24-hour shifts that day?
I was.
And at approximately 4:45 p.m., are you aware of a call that came into the station for medical assistance?
Yeah.
And what was your assigned apparatus at that time?
Paramedic 1, the frontline ambulance.
And were you working by yourself or with a partner on that ambulance?
I would have had a partner.
Do you recall on this particular call what your role was for that call on the ambulance?
I was the primary patient caregiver.
And what does that mean?
It means that the medical decision-making comes from me, and then I write the report after the fact.
And so your partner on the ambulance that day, what was his responsibility?
Driving the apparatus and backing me up.
And in your training and experience as a paramedic and with Marshfield Marshfield Fire Department, because all of the firefighters are dual certified or dual trained, do other officers or other firefighters often assist when you're responding for patient care?
Absolutely.
When your ambulance arrived at Moraine Street that particular day, what were your observations of what was the situation on scene?
When we were first arrived on scene, there wasn't much outside. When we entered the home, we were directed to our patient, who was lying supine on the floor. As far as the rest of the scene goes, I went directly to the patient.
And when you say supine, just for
I'm sorry, lying flat on his back.
Thank you. Did you notice any other non-emergency personnel in the home?
I believe Marshfield Police was there as well.
Okay. Did you notice any civilians in the home other than the?
Yeah, there was two women in the first room.
And I'm sorry, what was the last part of what you said?
In the first room when we first entered the home.
In that first room when you first entered, what did it appear to be, or what did it look like?
Kind of unremarkable to me.
Well, did it appear to be kind of a living area, a dining area, a kitchen, or something?
Yeah, a utility room, kind of like a three-season room almost, I guess.
Okay. And you indicated that Marshfield police officers were already on scene when you arrived, correct?
Correct.
And what did you observe them doing when you arrived?
I only saw one. He was kneeling at the patient's side.
And what was he doing?
I believe he was still assessing at that point.
Did you see the Marshfield officers rendering any sort of aid to the patient before you took over care?
He was kneeling by his side. I don't know if he had started CPR or not. I do not recall.
Did you speak to anyone prior to assessing the patient to try to ascertain what had happened or what kind of emergency you were responding to?
I did not. The patient's condition was grave, so we went directly into care.
When you say grave, what were your observations of the patient's condition?
He was not breathing and his heart was not beating.
What about his physical appearance? Did you make any observations about his clothing?
His clothing did seem a bit disheveled.
Did you observe any obvious signs of trauma?
At that particular point, no.
And if you did observe obvious signs of trauma, does a trauma situation or whether it's a medical situation inform how you would administer patient care?
If the patient is not breathing and the heart is not beating, no, it's the same treatment no matter what.
But is something that is associated with trauma, would that be something you would need to know as far as assessing patient care?
We would definitely want to know, yeah.
And in this circumstance, you did not see any identifiers of trauma?
Initially, right there at the side, no.
So was it fair to say your focus was then on the medical issue, meaning that he was unresponsive and not breathing with no pulse?
Correct.
As you were assessing the patient as he's on the floor, what are you doing to assess the situation and decide how to care for the patient?
Physical assessments, going over the patient's being, and then medical assessments, looking for breathing, pulse, things of that nature. When we found that his heart was not breathing, we did apply the Lucas device, which requires us to roll the patient to put a piece of plastic behind his back. At that point, we did notice some blood.
And how did you notice the blood?
When we rolled the patient, it was on our gloves.
Did you see the blood on the patient or just on your gloves?
Just on the gloves, because when we rolled them back, that's what we were focused on.
And when you rolled him back and now he's on his back, you didn't see any blood or any other obvious injuries, correct?
Not at that point, no.
Now, the other individuals that were in the home, the two women that were in the home, were you able to make observations of their demeanor while you were assessing the patient?
We did. So initially, the home seemed quiet. Things were fairly well in order. After a short time, I don't know what the occurrence was, but one of the women became pretty hysterical.
Do you know which one?
The older.
And did that affect your ability to care for the patient? That there was kind of commotion in this one?
It has. It heightens the stress level and so forth.
So what did you do as a result?
We asked that they move them away so they didn't watch what was happening.
And what did you do with the patient at that point?
We extricated, so we got him onto a longboard. All life-saving measures were in place, and we moved him out to the ambulance.
Now, when you get to the ambulance, what's the first thing you do when you get into the ambulance?
We reconfirmed that all primary life-saving measures are in place, which we did, and then we begin a secondary assessment.
And what does a secondary assessment involve?
In this particular instance, anybody that's not breathing and the heart is not breathing, it requires us to cut down their clothing, completely expose their body to look for any signs of the condition.
And so in this circumstance, did you remove at least the shirt of the patient?
We did.
And what did you notice when you removed the shirt?
Penetrating trauma to the upper left chest.
And when you say penetrating trauma, what does that mean?
A significant, probably 7 to 8 centimeters laceration with penetration deep into the chest cavity.
And what did you do to treat that?
Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do. We did apply a pressure dressing over that to try to stop any leakage of air. But other than that, there is no treatment.
And when that wound was discovered on his chest, did you then observe greater amounts of blood, or was it a lesser amount?
Not as much as we would expect.
In that secondary assessment, did you check any other areas of the patient's body after his clothes were removed?
We inspected his body fully. We did find some trauma to his back as well.
And when you discovered this trauma that hadn't been obvious inside the home, what did you do with that information?
Passed that on to my shift commander who was on scene, who then passed it on to the police department.
And was that Captain Smith at the time?
Correct.
Smith? Did you ever leave the ambulance to address what you observed in the wounds with the police officers that were in the home?
No, I was fully involved with the patient.
And while you were fully involved with the patient, was your partner on the ambulance that night, firefighter Magenzi, also involved with the patient?
Correct.
Do you recall if there was a third firefighter that was there assisting with care of this particular patient?
Firefighter Christopher Bradley.
And how long, or if you know, how long were you doing the secondary assessment and prepping the patient in order to stabilize and transport to the hospital?
Offhand, I don't recall. Probably 15 to 20 minutes, but it would be in my patient care report.
Okay. And before the patient was transported to the hospital, did you make any decisions about who was going to drive the vehicle and whether you needed another pair of hands on the back of the ambulance?
Yep, by our policy, anything in an arrest situation where somebody's not breathing or their heart is not beating, we bring a third person.
And so is it fair to say that in this circumstance, firefighter Bradley drove the ambulance while firefighter Majensky stayed with you in the back of the ambulance?
Correct.
And when you get to the hospital, do you recall which hospital the patient was transported to?
South Shore Hospital.
What happens when you arrive at the South Shore Hospital with the patient?
We give a pre-entry notification, so I call the hospital to tell them that we're coming so that they're ready for our arrival. As soon as we arrive with a patient in this condition, we're directed immediately to a room where generally there's a team of people waiting for us, and then I give the report to that team.
While you were in the back of the ambulance in transport or en route to the hospital, did the patient ever regain pulse?
No.
Did he ever regain respiratory functions?
No.
Did you ever identify him to be responsive, meaning his eyes were open or he was alert or oriented?
Not at all.
I have no further questions.
Yeah.
Ross?
Thank you. Good morning, sir. Do I understand that you were the person for this shift who was going to be writing the reports and getting the call directly from dispatch?
So the way we work is we alternate. So we would take turns. So one call, I would be the primary patient caregiver, and then we switch. I drive. My partner becomes the caregiver. But either way, we all receive the call at the same time.
And so do you also switch the duty of who writes the report during the course of the shift?
Correct. Whoever the primary patient caregiver writes the report.
Writes the report. And they write that report basically as soon as the call is over, right?
Correct.
When the events are still fresh in the mind?
Correct.
And that's really important, isn't it? Because you're getting your fresh impressions right after it was that you heard the information that you got.
Yep.
And before you had an opportunity to be influenced by any, reports or facts you might learn along the way, right?
Our reports are based just on medical observation.
No, I understand that. And they're based on medical observation made immediately after you give or have those medical observations, right?
Correct.
And before you have an opportunity to hear any narratives about the case in any way that could possibly affect your memory.
No narrative would come into play. We specifically what we see and what we do.
Understood. But for example, if you heard information after the event about the event, 2-3 years later, you might remember what you heard about the event and not exactly what your observations were, perhaps. At least that's a worry. That's why you write the report right away.
We write it to transfer medical care, so we leave that with the hospital so everybody knows the whole case in general.
Yeah, and it's fresh in your mind when you write it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now,
Yes.
You wrote the report in this call, meaning the call to 679 Moraine Street on January 28, 2021.
Correct.
And as a typical report, you would mark down the reason for the call, right?
Generally.
Yeah. And you would write down it as you remembered when the memories were still fresh.
Yep.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm handing you a document, sir.
Okay.
Does that look like your report?
It does.
And if you could just tell the jury, does that look as though it was written at 17:12 or 5:12 p.m. on January 28, 2021?
In that vicinity, yeah. Yeah, that's when the signature was captured.
Right. So it was either written, you signed the report after you read it, correct?
Yes.
So in other words, it either was at 5:12 p.m. on that night or before
Should be it.
that you wrote the report. And I just want to make sure that I'm reading this correctly. When you talk about DISP, that stands for dispatched, right?
Correct.
And you wrote, am I reading this correctly? Dispatched for unresponsive mail with limited info.
Correct. Yep.
And you did that because that's what you remember the call came in at, right?
Correct.
Now, when you arrive at the scene, the police are already there.
Correct.
And by the time you arrive, you're not really noticing anything about those two women that are there, except that they're there. Your focus is primarily on the grave situation with the man on the floor, right?
Correct.
At some point, you notice that the older of the two women gets noticeably even more upset, correct?
Correct.
Did that happen to correspond to when the AED machine was taken out?
I can't say.
So it's possible that that could have corresponded to when the AED machine was taken out.
Potentially.
Yeah. Now, after bringing the patient to the ambulance and cutting off the patient's clothes, you notice the penetrating wound in the front over on the center. Was it center left or center right?
Upper left chest.
Upper left chest. At that point, the clothes are off the body, correct? When you notice that?
Well, the body's exposed. They're not necessarily off at that point, but it's exposed.
All right. May I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes.
And is it your testimony that as you expose the body, you notice a second cut? Or a second
On
penetrating wound?
the back, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if that was penetrating. We didn't determine at the time, but there was a laceration to the back.
When you wrote your report, did you say, and I'll take a look at this. You mentioned the wound that wound that you noticed on the back shoulder in that report?
I think I was looping it in with the injuries at the beginning of that and then no other trauma afterwards, but it didn't state clearly.
Okay. So there's no mention of the wound on the back. Clearly, it just says wound.
Correct.
Okay. Were you present when, after finding those wounds, you reported the matter to Lieutenant Smith?
Was I present? Yes.
Yeah, you were there. Where did that disclosure to Lieutenant Smith take place?
I believe he was a captain at the time, but that took place in the back of the ambulance.
Okay, I'm sorry. So it's outside?
In the ambulance, in the patient compartment of the ambulance.
Okay. Once you tell Captain Smith about the wound, do you see where he goes after that?
He exited the ambulance.
Did you see whether he had any conversations with any other personnel after that?
He said he was exiting to go speak with the police. I didn't follow him.
Were the police in the driveway at that point, in the house, or both?
I can't say.
Okay. Now, you said that when you came upon the scene, the patient was on the ground in a supine position, right?
Correct.
And you explained that what that meant is that it was on his back with his face pointing towards the ceiling.
Yes.
Is it often the case that the 911 operators or the dispatchers will give instructions to the people calling in the emergency about moving the body in a way to clear your airways?
Objection.
Basis.
Relevance.
Overruled.
That does happen, right?
Emergency medical dispatchers will give instructions, yes.
Including if someone's, for example, on their face, to turn him over onto his back, for example, to initiate life-saving measures at least immediately before anyone arrives.
Correct.
I have nothing further. Thank you.
Redirect. Just very briefly.
Why does that matter?
Mr. Cohen, you testified on direct examination that you noticed blood on your gloves only after you rolled the patient from his back, correct?
Correct.
You had to touch his back in order to roll him.
Correct.
When you got in the ambulance and located that deep penetrating wound, was your focus of patient care attended to that particular wound?
Absolutely. That was a significant wound.
Is that considered a trauma incident?
Major trauma.
And so would any other wound be your focus? So even the laceration you described on his back, would that be a trauma situation that you immediately had to address over the chest wound?
No.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Recross.
Sir, when you say that you got blood on your gloves as you were turning over the body, you're not suggesting that you know that the blood came from the patient's back, are you?
I know that there was blood on my glove.
Right. And you're not suggesting that the blood that got on your glove came from his back, are you?
I have no idea where the blood came from.
It could have come from all of your work doing CPR on the front part of his body.
After I exposed him, I would have to disagree and say no, because there was no blood on the front part of his body. It was a clean wound.
Okay, but wasn't there a Lucas machine hooked up to him at a certain point? And doesn't the Lucas machine have the capability of artificially creating or pumping the heart artificially?
It does.
And that can sometimes cause a little bit of extra bleeding, can't it?
It would.
Okay.
But I did not notice blood coming out of the chest.
You didn't notice it, but it's potential that blood could have come out while the Lucas machine was working, correct?
We rolled him.
Mhm.
The blood was on our gloves. Then we applied the Lucas machine.
Okay, so you don't apply the Lucas machine until he's already in the ambulance.
We were in the act of applying it. In order to do so, we have to roll the patient. We put a plastic board under him, roll him back over, and then clamp the Lucas machine to the board. That's the way to start it actually pumping.
Okay. And you're suggesting that you just didn't notice that you had blood on your hands before that? Or are you saying that you didn't have blood on your hands?
I noticed it immediately after we rolled him back.
Okay.
Prior to starting the Lucas.
But you're not suggesting that you might not have had blood on your gloves before that?
I had just applied my gloves. I didn't have blood on my gloves before that.
You're sure of that?
I'm positive.
Nothing further.
The witness may step down.
Thank you.
Jurors, how are you doing over there? Are you good to keep going? Anybody need a break? Why don't we do it that way? Hearing no break, we'll have the next witness.
Maybe just briefly approach before I call the witness?
Yes? The Commonwealth may call its next witness.
The Commonwealth would call Thomas Loughran.
Right there, sir. Raise your clerk, raise your hand.
Good morning. You solemnly swear that the testimony and evidence which is the court and jury and are not coming from the Commonwealth and the bar include none of the truth of God?
I do.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name for the record?
Yes, it's Trooper Thomas Loughran, Loughran.
And you identified yourself as a trooper, so what agency employs you?
Mass State Police
And how long have you been with the Massachusetts State Police?
since 2006.
What is your current assignment with the State Police?
I'm currently assigned to crime scene services.
Can you explain to us what the crime scene services section of the Massachusetts State Police, what they do?
Yeah, so we document anything from fire investigations, crashes, unattended deaths, homicides. We process evidence that's submitted by outside agencies for fingerprints. We process crime scenes, things of that nature.
And where are you primarily based out of?
Lakeville.
And I'm sorry, did I already ask you how long you've been a trooper?
Yes, since 2006.
Thank you. Do you have to undergo any specific training to work in the crime scene services section?
Yes, I do.
What kind of training did you undergo?
So to begin, we started from May to about the end of August, early September. I went out to Maynard. There was a lot of in-house training on operating our cameras, crime scene documentation, processing crime scenes, developing fingerprints. We get a lot of training. I've gotten hundreds of hours from outside agencies. Bond Smith and Associates is a big one. They're a forensic science training group. We do a lot of things like processing crime scenes, latent fingerprint training, things of that nature from them.
When you describe one of your roles as kind of documenting a crime scene, how does the crime scene services section document crime scenes?
Typically with photographs, but in more serious scenes or at the request of any departments, we also can do scene diagrams, scene videos.
And when you respond to a particular crime scene, are you as the trooper in charge of what occurs at the scene, or are there other law enforcement parties present that had already secured a scene?
There would be other law enforcement present that secure the scene.
I'm going to draw your attention to January 28th of 2021. Do you recall working that day or being called out to work that day?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall being called out to the town of Marshfield?
Yes.
And where were you directed to go in Marshfield?
Initially, I was directed to go to the Marshfield Police Department.
And after learning a little bit more about what had transpired at the police department, were you directed to a particular residence in the town of Marshfield?
Yes, I was.
And fair to say that was at 679 Moraine Street?
That's correct, yes.
Were there other law enforcement officers on scene when you arrived?
Yes, there was.
What law enforcement agencies?
Marshfield PD and the State Police Plymouth County Detective Unit.
Do you recall if there were any civilians on scene by the time you arrived there?
I do not recall that, no.
And as far as you are aware, when you arrived, the emergent situation had left that particular location, correct?
I'm sorry, one more time?
When you arrived there, there was no emergent situation going on, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So there was no nobody present as far as a body to document or anything like that?
Correct.
Fair to say fire department and ambulances were not on scene when you arrived?
That's correct, they were not on scene.
And at the stage in which you're called out to a scene, is it fair to say that other law enforcement would have already secured that particular scene?
Yes, correct.
And why is it important to secure a scene for crime scene services?
Because prior to my arrival, I'm going to document the crime scene as is. You don't want to disturb anything to the extent possible.
And when you arrived on scene, did you have any reason to believe that anything in the home had been disturbed once the person that they were treating had left?
After the person that they had been treating had left, no.
When you arrive at a crime scene, are you the only trooper that arrives from the state police crime scene section?
It depends. In this instance, no.
And so in this particular instance, what other members of the state police crime scene team were present?
Trooper William Watson and Lieutenant Peter Benson.
And oftentimes when you're called out to crime scenes, are there also another group of people from the state police that are also called out simultaneously from a different unit?
Yes.
And what unit also usually comes out?
The crime scene response unit, they'll send out a forensic scientist if requested.
And the members of the crime scene response unit, are those generally troopers or civilians or something else?
Civilians.
And do they work with you in processing crime scenes?
Yes, we work hand in hand.
In this particular instance, was there a member of the crime scene response team present as well on January 28th in Marshfield?
Yes, there was.
And who was that?
I believe that was forensic scientist Amy Joy.
Now, as far as the scene itself, how would you describe the location that you arrived at when you arrived at 679 Moraine Street?
The location was off of a main road in Marshfield. It's a white single-family home.
Okay. I'm going to show you on the screen if you can see. It's already been marked as exhibit number 2. Are you able to see that image?
Yes.
Is that a fair and accurate representation of the home that you arrived on January 28th, 2021?
Yes, it is.
And is it fair to say this is a picture you would have taken?
Yes.
When you arrive on scene with crime scene services to first document a scene, how do you approach documenting a scene?
Typically, when we arrive on scene, the first thing I'm going to do is take an exterior photo of the scene.
And that was what we just viewed in exhibit number 2, correct?
That's correct.
Fair to say you also documented other parts of the exterior of the home as well?
Correct.
And do you limit that examination, that exterior examination, or do you kind of just take everything that you can photograph in?
So again, it depends on the type of call I'm going to. In this situation, I documented the entire exterior of the house.
And once the exterior of the house is documented, do you also go through the interior of the house?
Yes, I do.
And in this particular instance, did you photograph the interior of the house?
Yes, I did.
And when you do photograph this type of call, do you limit the potential areas where you photograph, or do you photograph everything?
Initially, we photographed the entire house.
And you also mentioned that at times crime scene services also will take video.
That's correct.
Is this a situation in which a video of the premises was also taken?
Yes.
Okay. Going back first, and if we could talk about a couple of photographs.
Yes.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
Trooper, I'm just going to hand you a photograph. You can take a look.
Yep.
Is that the image in that photograph familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
And what do you know that photograph to depict?
That's going to be the dining room of the residence.
Is it a fair and accurate representation of what the dining room of the residence looked like when you arrived on January 28th, 2021?
Yes.
I'd move to admit this as an exhibit.
No objection.
Any objection? No. It'll be marked in a minute as Exhibit 5, the photo of the dining room.
And while I'm here, I'm just going to show you another photo.
Okay.
Is that also familiar to you?
Yes.
And fair to say that's the same general area from a slightly different vantage point.
That's correct.
I would move to admit this as the next exhibit.
Any objection?
No.
Marked in a minute as Exhibit 6.
I'm showing you another image, Trooper.
Yep.
And that is also familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
And what do you know that image to depict?
Again, it's the dining room from a different angle going into the living room.
Objection.
It'll be marked in a minute as Exhibit 6. Excuse me, Exhibit 7.
And one more for now, if you can take a look.
Yep.
And is that familiar to you as well?
Yes, it is.
And is that fair and accurate representation of slightly different area off the dining room of 679 Marine Street?
Yes, it is.
I'd move to admit this as the next exhibit.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
The area off of the dining room photo will be admitted as Exhibit 8.
Trooper Lapp, I'm showing you what's been marked now as Exhibit 5. You've identified that as the dining room area of the home, correct?
Correct, yes.
And did this area become an area of interest as you were processing the first level of this home on this particular evening?
Yes, it did.
And when you walk into the house, or when you entered into the house, was this the main area you came into, or do you recall if you came in a different way?
To the best of my recollection, I believe it was right off the area of the entrance that I came into, if I recall correctly.
On the front of the house?
Yes.
But you do note in this photograph that there is another door that's kind of off to the side of the house that appears in the middle of the top middle of the photograph.
Correct.
And while you were there on scene and there were other law enforcement present, did people use that? Did that appear to be a door that was frequently used for entry and exit?
I do not recall that door being used.
But there was nothing blocking anybody's ability to get in and out of that door.
No, I don't recall that.
Showing you on the screen what's now been marked as exhibit number 6, another different view of that dining room area. Again, towards the middle of the photograph, there's a doorway there. Do you know what doorway that leads to in this home, or what's through that doorway?
I don't recall specifically what goes down there.
Okay. How about if we look at what's been marked as exhibit number 8? Okay. Now that's a little better vantage point of the doorway. Does that?
If I recall correctly, that went up to another height and level. I believe there was a set of stairs in the area that went up to the second floor, if I remember correctly.
Okay. Now, in this particular picture of exhibit number 8, there's like a plaid jacket. Do you know if that is something that's associated with the dining room table or a different area of the house?
I'm sorry. I'm just looking for it. I'm looking for a plaid jacket. You said.
I'm sorry.
There is a pointer over there if anyone wishes to use it.
So if you're looking at the image on the screen, maybe to the far left corner.
Excuse me. I just got to get up for the glare.
May I approach the point?
You may.
Thank you. That's okay. So I was just, my characterization, if this is flat or not, I'm not familiar. But is it fair to say kind of this left side of the area on the other side of this item would be the dining room table that we saw in the previous photos?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And this area at the bottom of the photograph, was that designated as an area of interest when you arrived on scene?
Yes, it was.
And why was it an area of interest?
There was a fixed blade, black handled knife on the ground.
And to your knowledge, that had been there from the time that the Marshfield officer secured the scene?
Correct, yes.
I'm sorry, and I probably should have shown Exhibit 7 first to make it a little bit more clear, but showing you now Exhibit 7, you see partially the dining room table, correct?
Yes, I do.
And then that opens into the area we just saw in Exhibit number 8, where that wood floor and the knife is located, correct?
Correct, yes.
And then that opens further into a living space.
That's correct, yes.
Now, other than this particular area of the dining and living area, is it fair to say that your attention was also drawn to the kitchen area of the home?
That's correct.
And particularly based on the knife you referred to that's seen in Exhibit number 8, was there something that was located in the kitchen that kind of related to that particular style of knife that you can recall?
I believe, if I remember correctly, possibly a butcher block or a holder for it.
Your Honor, could we caution with regard to the leading?
Yes, ask non-leading questions, please.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm going to show you another photograph. Is that familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
Did you take that photograph?
Yes, I did.
And what does the photograph depict?
It's a partially open drawer with, I guess you would refer to as a holder for knives and utensils.
And did you document this as part of your documentation of the crime scene that day?
Yes, I did.
I would move to evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
It'll be marked as Exhibit 9 and admitted into evidence.
Trooper, do you recall if the manner in which the drawer appears in the photograph is consistent with how you observed it before taking the photograph?
Yes, I do.
I'm just going to show you another photograph.
Okay.
And is that familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
And what do you know that photograph to depict?
Again, it's the partially open drawer with all the utensils.
And is that just a little closer review of the actual drawer itself?
Correct, yes.
I'd move to the next exhibit.
Any objection?
I can't actually see the photograph. Your Honor, could we be heard at sidebar briefly?
Yes.